Hey everybody, lesson 2 of chapter 13, the origins of the Cold War. And remember that the Cold War is this time frame between 1945 and 1991, a big long chunk of time. And what we're talking about is a difference between the communist East, as we talked about yesterday, and the democratic West, as we mentioned yesterday, with that iron curtain splitting the West and the East, and each side having satellite nations. So what happens here is, as the Cold War is getting underway in the late 1940s, President Truman asks his advisor, this guy whose head I'm circling, a guy named George Kennan, to tell him what we know about the Soviets. And Kennan, who's over in Moscow, sends a really long message, a telegram to Truman. It's thousands of words long. And according to Kennan, what he says is that we can defeat communism, and that to do it, we're not going to necessarily have to go to war with the Soviet Union. Instead, what we have to do is use whatever means we can, politics, the military, the economy, anything that we have at our disposal to contain the USSR and let that country fall apart on its own. So here's the Soviet Union. And Kennan's idea is that we should somehow, as best we can, use whatever resources we have to prevent the Soviets from influencing other countries around the world. And if we can do that, the people inside the Soviet Union who live in this country will want to destroy it on their own because they'll be tired of having no freedom and no economy of their own. So Truman agrees to this idea of containment. He says, okay, we'll prevent the expansion of the Soviet Union, and we're going to do it in a lot of different ways. To contain the Soviet Union, President Truman comes up with his first policy to do that. He calls it the Truman Doctrine. It's a type of containment. And he says that we're going to fight the Soviet Union wherever communism tries to pop up around the world. He sees this as a really essential part of containment, that we're committed to fighting communism no matter where it appears around the world. And he'll have other ideas as well to do that, like the Marshall Plan. That'll be another way in which he's going to want to contain the Soviet Union. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But let me give you some practical examples. Stalin is going to try to influence countries around the world and make them go communist, like Iran or Turkey. You know, if you look at this map right here, why would Stalin want Iran and Turkey? Well, for number one, here's the Soviet Union in red, right? And here are those satellite nations in Eastern Europe that we talked about yesterday. Well, Turkey's really close to both of those, and it has access to a port that'll be open all year round for his navy and trade. And Iran, also close to the Soviet Union, has a ton of oil. So Stalin wants to try and turn Turkey and Iran into satellite nations. Stalin wants those oil reserves in Iran, and he's going to demand joint control of the Straits of Dardanelles that Turkey owns, and that crisis that here Stalin might try to control these countries is going to trigger a crisis that influences our Truman Doctrine. So what we say, how do we respond to that? We threaten to involve our military. We actually say that we'll send our army into Iran if the Soviets don't withdraw and they back down. And we say to Turkey, we'll give you $400 million, Turkey, if you agree not to become a satellite nation of the Soviet Union and deny them the Straits of Dardanelles so they don't have access to that port. And it works. Turkey and Iran agree to not become Soviet satellites. They agree to become American satellites. That's a really big deal because it shows that the Truman Doctrine can stop the spread of communism around the world. So As we're working on this, we're going to see the Soviets not quit. They're going to look for other places to kind of expand to and try and convince those places to become communist. Some examples there are going to be in Germany, in Berlin, and we're going to see how we as Americans will respond to these crises and still attempt to contain the Soviet Union. So, what does all of this look like? We know that the Soviets were able to create satellite countries in Eastern Europe. And what we want to do is say, all right, we need to find a way to contain them behind the Iron Curtain. So President Truman comes up with the Marshall Plan, essential for containment along with the Truman Doctrine. And what it does is it says we're going to give $4 billion in supplies and machinery to Western Europe to help rebuild those countries after World War II. And that should prevent the economic appeal of communism for the average person. So every place that we see the Soviets trying to expand past the Iron Curtain, which is that physical barrier that separates communism from democracy, we will attempt to use our economy to keep those countries democratic. We'll give them money to limit the economic appeal of communism. On top of that, we will then go further. We'll say, all right, you want to kind of convince people to become communist? We're going to merge the British, French, and American zones of Germany that we controlled after World War II into one new country called West Germany. And you can see it over here in blue. This used to be divided up into different zones controlled by the Allies. No more. The Soviets say, all right, we will create our own country called East Germany, and we'll make it communist. And in reaction to the fact that we will make this new country, and the Soviets believing they'll never get reparations from Germany, they blockade the nation of, or the city of Berlin, hoping that we'll reconsider and abandon it. Understand what we're looking at here. We create this country of West Germany, and the Soviets are angry because they believe they'll never get the reparations they want. So they blockade Berlin. This is the city of Berlin right here. This little city, if we shrunk it down, it fits right into that little tiny yellow spot right there. Does that make sense? Like it's the two little cities right there, right? That's what they are, right? One will fit right into the other. And remember that we had divided up not just Germany into zones, but also Berlin. So what we have here is an area of West Berlin that is free, that is democratic, and an East Berlin that is communist. And this area is right inside communist East Germany, right? So what we do, instead of fighting and giving up West Berlin to the communists, we fly planes overhead to drop food and supplies. It's called the Berlin Airdrop, and you can see some of those supplies right there flying over Berlin, dropping food and supplies to the people of West Berlin to keep them safe. We could land a plane like every, I don't know how many seconds or minutes we could land a plane and have it there. It was pretty cool. What that does is, over a year, we fly those supplies in, and then finally the Soviets stop the blockade, and we end up holding on to West Berlin and West Germany. Another example where we contain the Soviets. But it doesn't all work out well because there's going to be increasing military threats to this whole situation. And I want you to think about it like this. Everything that the Soviets will do to try and stop them. So the Soviets go to Iran for oil and Turkey for the Straits of the Dardanelles for a port for their navy. We give money to those countries and we threaten a nuclear response. The Soviets establish satellites in Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain. We use the Marshall Plan to keep other countries from going communist. The Soviets want to spread communism into other areas of Germany that were controlled by Britain, France, and America. So we create the nation of West Germany and West Berlin as part of that. So the Soviets blockade West Berlin so that we'll give it up and get reparations for them. So we fly airplanes into West Berlin and try and solve and save those people. So it's kind of like this: everything that we do, they do, we do to kind of contain communism and keep it from spreading. And we're going to see that happen again and again and again. But we're not always going to be successful. There will be threats to containment, which we'll see in just a little while. So let me give you some examples about what I mean. That Berlin blockade convinced Western Europe, it convinced us that more needed to be done to contain the Soviets. So what we do is the countries of Western Europe and America create NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a type of containment, and its goal is mutual defense. We're going to protect each other. And what we do is we say to West Germany, you can rearm and join the organization. So all of a sudden, right, if we drew a line in here, this is the Iron Curtain, right, that we're looking at. And you can see that pretty much all of these countries in blue decide that we need to protect ourselves from the communist Soviet army and the armies of Eastern Europe. And we say to West Germany that you can have guns just 4 years after World War II ended. This is in 1949, just 4 years after World War II ends. And we say to West Germany that we're going to give you guns again. These people who were former Nazis, and many of them still feel and think and believe that they are Nazis, this makes the Soviet Union furious. And you think it would, right? Because just 4 years ago, these people who were Nazis were killing tons and tons of Soviets. So in response, the Soviet Union says, nope, we're going to create something called the Warsaw Pact, an alliance, a military alliance, including all of the Soviet-controlled countries of Eastern Europe. And so what this map shows you is the different countries that are part of NATO in blue and the Warsaw Pact in red. And really, you can understand this, that in response to that decision by NATO to allow West Germany to rearm and to join the organization, that they're really upset about that. So they want to defend themselves from what they think might be oncoming German aggression. But where containment works in some places, it's going to fail in others. We do not stop containment from spreading or communism from spreading to Asia. We fail. And what we end up with is a large part of the world being communist. So here's what we see. There's the Soviet Union. Big country. Mongolia goes communist in 1922, but no one ever cares about Mongolia. Here's Eastern Europe, which goes communists right after the war. Here's Turkey, where we were able to contain it and stop communism. Here's Iran, where we were able to stop communism. But here is North Korea, little tiny North Korea, right here. And we were not able to stop North Korea from going communist. Happens in 1945. And here's China, which is going to go communist in 1949. Now, why does this matter? Because the Korean Peninsula was split up into two different pieces after World War II. Communist North, Democratic South. And then in China, communists under a guy named Mao Zedong, that's this dude right above me, right there, that guy. Mao Zedong, they'd been fighting for power for decades. And we support the nationalists, the enemies of the communists, led by a guy named Chiang Kai-shek. But they lose to China due to poor planning, corruption. They flee to Taiwan in 1949, and all of China goes communists. And this shocks us. We had no idea this was going to come, that we were unable to contain communism. And it kind of results in a dramatic shift in power and policy towards Japan, which was once our enemy. It now becomes our closest ally, and it still is, because it's a way of containing China. So these countries in green are going to become ways of containing communism in Asia. When China goes communist in 1949, Japan will help us contain it. Taiwan will help us contain it. Former colony, the Philippines, will help us contain communism from spreading further in Asia. Add to that the Soviets say they have the bomb, and America's freaking out in that we're not able to contain communism in those countries. In fact, it gets even worse when the Korean War breaks out in 1950, when the troops of North Korea in red invade the South in blue. America and its forces that are in South Korea are driven back, and we're losing bad. So that by September of 1950, this is what it looks like. In red, everything controlled by the communists. In blue, what we control with the South Koreans and the United Nations. Not a good scene. We are able to get reinforcements there so that by a few months later, we're able to really show and push back those communist forces that had invaded the South. Then all of a sudden, what happens? China draws the war to protect its border, and our troops are again driven back. And this is what it looks like. After years and years of kind of fighting there, 3 different years, we have this kind of, again, same split. It goes so far that Americans, under General MacArthur, actually want to invade China and use nuclear weapons. Truman says, no, we're not going to do that. MacArthur publicly criticizes him. Congress joins sides with Truman and says we should have a limited war to contain communism. We shouldn't invade China. Not what we should do. This is really important for you to understand. Circle this, star it, highlight it. Seriously, do it right now. Because every war that we've ever fought since then has been a limited war. This is really important because when MacArthur's fired and Truman leaves office and Eisenhower comes in, we end up finally negotiating a peace, an armistice concerning Korea. And that the battle line that's there is going to become the new border between North and South. That war is still going on. It's just an armistice. It's never actually been finished. That war has still bubbling along. In fact, as a result of China going communist and the Korean War kind of still bubbling along with that armistice, it's a turning point in the Cold War. There's a major military buildup in Asia. Thousands of U.S. troops are still in Korea. We're still dealing with this guy right here, Kim Jong-un, kind of looks like me with the chubby cheeks, who really wants us to respect his authority. We're still dealing with all of this. So that's a good summary, and we'll deal with more of that as we go.